Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 112, and this is for our class for Thursday, the 19th. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Raisin in the Sun, but before I do so, I wanted to draw your attention to an error on the course outline that you might have already observed, where I had indicated that Thanksgiving was on Tuesday, the 1st of December, which is not the case. Thanksgiving is Thursday, the 26th of November. So basically, what we need to do are switch the two classes. The class that I have scheduled in our course outline to be held on the 26th of November will instead be held on the 1st of December. And Thanksgiving, instead of the 1st of December, will be held when it traditionally is on the 26th of November. So basically, we're just flipping things around. And in terms of some of the upcoming due dates, because we're getting close to finishing up our second unit, which is on drama, soon you will have a second journal due on drama. And your journal will be very similar to what you did with the first journal with short story. So if you remember for the first journal with short story, I asked you to select 3 short stories in our short story unit and to write approximately a page or so about each of those short stories. Any thoughts or reflections or questions that you might have. So I'm going to ask you to do something very similar for the drama, to select the 3 dramas from our drama unit. And since we've studied only 3, the 3 dramas will be Oedipus the King, Midsummer Night's Dream, and Raisin in the Sun, and devoting approximately a page or so to each of those dramas to talk about your thoughts, reflections, questions, things of that nature. And I evaluate those journals informally on a checkmark system where I do not evaluate for grammar or mechanics. And certainly you can write more than the page or so for each of the dramas, but you will have the opportunity to write more about drama when we come to the formal paper. And you can see that what I've done is I've put some suggested paper topics in our syllabus and other documents folder. Some ideas of things that you could pursue with the dramas. And again, these are all very broad ideas that you could perhaps address with either Oedipus the King or A Midsummer Night's Dream or A Raisin in the Sun. And that's not to say that there aren't other ideas, and we'll talk more about the paper as the semester progresses. But basically, I encourage you to look at some of those suggested topics, which I'll review once we're done with Raisin in the Sun. And that might also assist you in terms of putting together your syllabus. And our paper number 2, which is going to be on drama, will be very similar to what you did with short story, approximately 4 to 5 pages or so, but as long or as short as it needs to be, talking about one particular element within one of the dramas. It is possible to compare and contrast, let's say, 2 characters within 2 dramas, but obviously the more drama that you include in your analysis, then probably the more complex your analysis will have to be. So I'm hopeful that some of the thoughts on your journals might give you some direction on how you want to proceed with your paper. My understanding is at this point I've returned all of the short story papers that were returned to me. So if it turns out that you sent me a short story paper and you have not received it back from me, please let me know. I know that I've been receiving revisions, and you've got up until the ending of the semester to submit in a revision. I will evaluate those last, so I'm not working on those right now. I'm working on other assignments from other classes. I ask that if you do a revision, that you hand in the original paper with my commentary on it, along with your revision, that you attach both of those to an email and send them to me so that I can compare them and contrast them. But in terms of where we are with Raisin in the Sun, we watched a performance that happened to be American Playhouse performance with Danny Glover. Not necessarily the best known performance. The best known would be probably the Sidney Poitier movie that Lorraine Hansberry worked on herself. That said, I think that what we saw was a very real performance because it appeared on stage rather than being a screenplay, which is what the Sidney Poitier version is. And it definitely is longer than the Sidney Poitier version because they haven't deleted some scenes the way that many adaptations do for Raisin in the Sun. Usually they delete, for instance, the entire character of Mrs. Johnson because it's costly to hire an actor to play the role, an understudy, wardrobe, and all of that. And also, you can delete that scene and not necessarily sacrifice understanding of the plot. But as we'll discuss, she's an integral character, so it's important to see her. And I had suggested when you were viewing Raisin in the Sun to think about the importance of names and also to think about the Langston Hughes poem that begins the play with what happens to a dream deferred. So I thought next class I would address that, what happens to a dream deferred, put closure onto A Raisin in the Sun, and begin our poetry section, which is our last unit. And today I would talk about names in A Raisin in the Sun. And even if you think about something like Mama, and some of you indicated this in your attendance question, her first name is Lena, and that's no mistake because these characters lean on her for her love, for shelter, utilities, food, tuition, hobbies, all of it. Remember, Benita doesn't have a job, so the assumption is that Mama, and in some part Walter, is helping to finance her education. At one point in the play, Walter bemoans the fact that he's unable to buy Travis new shoes, and the idea is that all of the extra money is going to help support Benita. But we'll talk about Benita in a moment. That said, as strong as Mama is throughout the play, and she's completely unwavering, and one of my favorite scenes is at the end when she's talking with Benita, who's completely given up hope with her brother. And Mama says, when do you think is the time to love somebody? When they've done good? And everybody's happy? No, it's when they've done bad, and you don't know the hills and the valleys that they've traveled. And I've always loved that particular scene. That's not to say that Mama doesn't have her negative qualities. She definitely imposes her religious views upon Benita, and there was mixed responses to that. Some of you indicating that you felt some empathy for Benita because she is an independent person, and others of you indicating that Benita is living under Mama's roof, and just the mere fact that Mama is her mother would require Benita to show a certain level of respect. So you can see that these are multi-dimensional characters. They're not flat in the way that we saw with Oedipus, or even in the way that we saw with the Midsummer Night's Dream. These people are very real with strengths and weaknesses, and it's probably one of the reasons why the play was such a resounding success. And Mama can be very domineering. Certainly at the beginning of the play when she's interacting with her daughter-in-law, Ruth, about the raising of Travis and whether or not he's eating a warm breakfast and if he's going out enough to play and is he spending too much time on his homework and so forth and so on. And certainly, the idea is that all of this comes from love, from Mama's perspective. She wants the best for him. But it's not her son, that's her grandson. But then again, all of this is happening under her roof. She is the matriarch, and she basically is the person who is providing the housing for all of these generations of family. And this is a play about multi-generational conflict and also multi-generational unity as well, which could make for an interesting paper topic if you were searching for a paper topic. But that said, obviously, her house, her rules. But again, this isn't necessarily her child, and I can only imagine the challenges of being a child as an adult living with their parent, let alone a daughter-in-law or living with their in-laws as an adult, trying to raise their own children. That said, what we've got is a Walter Lee who's supposed to be the head of the house because now he's become the man of the house because now his father has died. But he hasn't taken on that role because he hasn't illustrated a certain level of responsibility. And note the thinking at the time period in which this play came out. Definitely gender is an issue in this play and that the man should be responsible for the household. Walter Lee, his last name, or Walter Lee is named after his father, and he is a junior, which means that basically he's supposed to live up to his father's image. And his father's last name, which is the surname that Lena took on, is Younger. So this is about the Younger family. And there are all kinds of associations with Young, both positive and negative. If you remember when we talked about young Goodman Brown, we talked about youth. oftentimes representing things like innocence and being naive, and needing to be educated, but it also represents hope and it represents opportunity. And I think all of those elements are relevant to these characters in this particular play, as they are youngers and the newer generation, each one standing out for themselves. Even Mama left the South to try to get a better life for herself. And Mama's brave enough to try to buy a home. Actually, more than try, she does buy a home in an all Caucasian neighborhood in a time that's highly racist, which she knows that they will face discrimination at least and violence at worst. But Walter Lee is living in the shadow of his father. His mother and the family wants him to be the man his father was, and he's having increasing difficulty in being able to do that. He wants to be more than his father, and in trying to be more, he oftentimes is less than his father. So much so that one of his nicknames happens to be Prometheus, and this is a Greek god. So when George Murchison calls Walter Prometheus, and Prometheus says, and Walter says, I bet he made it up. No, he didn't make it up. Prometheus is a Greek god who stole fire, basically, and gave that to humans and was punished accordingly. And the parallel is that Walter, too, wants more than what he should have, and he will be punished accordingly. And in fact, Walter does steal at one point when he's given part of the insurance money to put away for his sister's education and part for his own use. Instead, he uses all of it for himself. So basically, he steals his sister's share and loses it all in a bad business deal. So Prometheus suits him well. Walter definitely wants more out of life. He wants a liquor store because he wants to achieve the American dream of owning a business so that he doesn't have to be subservient to anyone, of being respected, of having income, and being able to educate his son. And the scene in which he talks about how he wants to educate his son, and he wants his son to have the freedom to choose whatever college he wants and to be able to pursue whatever dream he wants, is quite noble. Just like I think some of Walter's comments about, well, why can't I put pearls around my wife's neck? But that's not to say that Walter doesn't have selfishness to him. He drinks too much, and he has grandiose visions about what money can buy, convinced that money can buy respect and happiness, and it can't. And that's one of the major lessons of this particular play. And Walter will be punished for his hubris, much like Prometheus was punished for trying to steal from the gods. And we talked about Oedipus the king, and he also being punished for his hubris. Ruth Younger, his wife, now there's a biblical Ruth, and she's a long-suffering daughter-in-law in the Bible. So the name suits her in terms of this particular play, as we see that Ruth is torn between trying to support Walter, her husband, but also being supportive of Mama, because she has more of the temperament of Mama. She's more even-keeled, and she definitely is more reasonable and rational and commonsensical than Walter is. And she's trying to negotiate the two. And we know that one of the major plot twists is that she's become pregnant, not that she planned that pregnancy, and now she's contemplating having an abortion. And this is particularly significant, not only because of the religious household in which they live in, but during this time period, abortion was illegal. So therefore, she's going to be engaging in an illegal and very dangerous activity, one that could put her life at risk. And Walter, at first, is convinced that she would never do such a thing. And she says, yes, she would, because the economic situation is so dire that ultimately, to save the family members that exist, she would contemplate doing something like that. And at the ending of the play, though, we see how she changes, where she says that she's willing to strap that baby on her back if necessary and work and clean all the households of Chicago if necessary. So we definitely see a transformation of her character, much like we see a transformation in Walter's character and even in Mama's character. Because remember, my attendance question, my last one, was should Mama have given Walter that money? Because considering Walter's previous behavior, it's very likely that he would squander it, which is exactly what he does. So from a commonsensical standpoint, no, she shouldn't have given him the money because he probably would have lost it, which he did. However, from a parental standpoint, perhaps it was the most important thing she could do is to show her trust in her son, even though she knew that maybe her son hadn't earned that trust, and offering him the opportunity to fail and fail badly so that he could learn from that lesson, something that I suspect all parents have to do at some point with their children. So you can see that it's complex, this decision. There is no real right or wrong answer of should she or should she not. But the reality is, if she hadn't entrusted Walter with the money, he likely would never have learned the lesson that he learns at the ending of the play, that dignity and self-respect cannot be bought. Now, Travis Younger, notice how Travis does not have his first name as Walter. So he's not in the shadow or the footsteps of his grandfather or his father. He's his own individual being. And he chooses his own way. We see this at the very beginning of the play when he says that he wants to carry groceries to earn money, which could be seen as a positive because he has a good work ethic. Could also be seen as a negative, that being so young and yet he's already consumed with thoughts about money. How could he not be, considering that Walter is his father? Also, later on in the play, when the family buys Mama a gift, it seems like a subtle thing, but it's an important one, where Travis does not join in with the rest of the family to buy a group gift. Travis decides to buy a gift on his own, which shows his independence and his autonomy. And then we've got Beneatha Younger, who is a rather complex character. Now, the name Beneatha is supposed to bring forth ideas of beneath, whether the fact that she could be seen as beneath others because of things like her ethnicity, the fact that she's black, or because of her economic status, the fact that she's poor, or because of her gender, the fact that she's female. So she's got 3 strikes against her, if you will. However, we also know that Beneatha is quite proud and in fact might see others as beneath her because she has intelligence when others don't. She has education when others don't. And she's culturally aware when others don't. She also is arrogant. And that too is something that we have to keep in mind when we are given one of her nicknames, Alayo, one for whom bread or food is not enough. In other words, this is an ambitious person. And ambition can be both positive and negative. Certainly the idea that she wants to be a doctor, which is a very esteemed profession and one often associated with males. So we can see how she's a trendsetter in that particular respect. We learn about her hobbies, and most of her hobbies she talks about that she flits from one to another. And you could say she does the same with the boyfriends as well, that she has 2. And perhaps that's just evidence of her youth where she's trying out new things. Or it could also show that she doesn't necessarily have a certain level of direction or stability. The hobbies she chooses tend to be rather expensive and oftentimes associated with privileged cultures. Things like photography, horseback riding in particular. This family lives in Chicago. Horseback riding is not a reality in the streets of Chicago in the way that it might be in the country. So these are expensive hobbies that one assumes the Younger family, mostly Mama and perhaps somewhat Walter, are helping to finance because there's never any reference to her having any kind of job. And we also assume that the family is financing her tuition. And of course, her concern is about medical tuition now that she's in college. So we can definitely see Beneatha in the positive and that she is open to new ideas and things with her hobbies, but also the negatives in that her hobbies could be seen as a waste of money for a family that doesn't have a whole lot of money, especially if she doesn't commit to them. And again, horseback riding in Chicago isn't very commonsensical. She is very much concerned with her cultural identity. She's very resistant to assimilation, yet again, she engages in hobbies that might be considered assimilationist, and she does date George Murchison, who is very much an assimilationist. But by the ending of the play, we see how she's chosen Joseph Asagai, the idea that she wants to embrace her cultural identity. And it's one of the things that she's trying to teach her family about as well. She also has a nickname. Her nickname is Benny. And this is a very male-centric kind of name. And this is important because much of the way that she lives her life, especially in the time period of this play, would be considered quite male in terms of her choice of education, profession, even the fact at one point that she says to Mama and Ruth to their disbelief that she's not even sure that she's going to get married one day. So she's very unique in many ways for her time. Joseph Asagai, who happens to be one of her suitors. You'll notice that he has a very Anglo-Americanized first name, Joseph, and a very African name for his surname, Asagai. So he's a mixture of the African and the American, which is something that Beneatha is trying to aspire to. He's the one that helps to encourage Beneatha's cultural identity, and he believes the purpose of education is to help others. There's a long speech where he talks about how he wants to return to Africa and be able to teach his people. He's in direct contrast to something like a George Murchison. And think about George Murchison's name, Murchison. In other words, he is the son of a merchant, Murchison, which is how he's acquired his money. His family is fairly well-to-do. First name George, which happens to be associated with an American president, George Washington. There was also a television show that came out in the 1970s, a sitcom entitled The Jeffersons, and it happens to be about an African American family that was able to achieve a certain level of economic success through owning a series of dry cleaning stores. And you can see that this story is somewhat similar to George Murchison's story. So I've always suspected that the individuals who put together that sitcom were inspired at least by some of George Murchison in this particular play. And he very much believes that the point of education is for making money rather than learning anything, which I can say makes any teacher's heart feel very sad. We are also introduced to Mr. Lindner. He is the only real Caucasian in the play. Mr. is a title of respect. It's something that he's given that the other characters aren't because of the color of their skin. And he represents racist America when he comes as the, quote, welcoming committee, unquote, from Clybourne Park, the place where Mama has bought a house in this all-Caucasian neighborhood, not because she wants to make a political statement, but she wanted to get the most house for the money that she has. And there was great irony in terms of housing during the time period, that rents would oftentimes be so high in the African-American community, they would be much, much higher than a mortgage would be. So basically, they would be trapped in renting forever. And if you could buy a home, the homes that you were allowed to buy would be in African-American neighborhoods that were more expensive, of lower quality. Now, it had just become legal for African-Americans to move into Caucasian neighborhoods, but there was still an incredible amount of backlash, which is exactly what Mama is experiencing. And anybody who dared to do such a thing knew that there could be some significant repercussions, which is the importance of Mrs. Wilhelmina Othello Johnson. Again, this is the character that oftentimes is deleted in certain productions. And her first name, Wilhelmina, is the female version of the name Will, because Othello is the female version of the name Othello, which happens to be a very famous Shakespearean play by William Shakespeare. So basically, this is Lorraine Hansberry's wink and nod to let us know that she's making a reference to Will Shakespeare and his play Othello, which happens to be the story about race, about a Moor, an African, who marries a Caucasian woman and the backlash that he experiences because of it, even from his own best friend. Actually, especially because of his own best friend. So the idea of Johnson, too, very common surname, just like we were talking about Brown is a common surname in Young Goodman Brown. So she represents the typical neighbor that the Youngers might have. And one would expect that they would experience obstacles and they would experience challenges from Caucasians, but not necessarily from their own people in their own community, their own neighbors, basically. And you may have noticed that there was great competition for the bathroom over the course of the play, and that's because multiple families who would be living on a floor of a building would share one bathroom. And basically, these were large structures that were divided up into smaller units, so the largest amount of rent could be charged. So basically, the Youngers are sharing their bathroom with lots of other family members, not only themselves, but with their neighbors as well. One of the reasons why they need to find another place to live is that they just simply need more space. But you would think that having a neighbor they've obviously socialized before, you would think that she would be supportive, and she is, but in a syrupy sweet kind of way. And I say this deliberately when we talk next class about the poem, A Dream Deferred by Langston Hughes. And that happens to be a statement within that particular poem, where she says that she's supportive of the family, but she also takes great delight in reminding them of the episodes of violence when African Americans have moved into Caucasian neighborhoods. And she has a long conversation with Mama that is in many ways quite inappropriate. when she suggests that perhaps Beneath is pregnant, when she pats Ruth's stomach, when she talks about that perhaps the Youngers are just a little bit too uppity. So this character, although she can be deleted from the play and the play would still make sense, I think it's important to illustrate the difficulties the Youngers would have amongst their own neighbors and amongst their own community. It reminds me of Ralph Ellison's Battle Royal, where the narrator had to fight against other African Americans. In other words, they were all pitted against each other for crumbs, which is an analogy for what happens in society as well, and that the disenfranchised fight against one another when the true enemy is someone it's outside of their community and outside of their society. So they basically are blindfolded to the truth, if you will, which we saw in a Battle Royal. Now, Walter, not too surprisingly, entrusts all of his money in a bad business deal with somebody named Bobo. Bobo happens to be slang for idiot, so Bobo is very aptly named. And also Willie, who runs off with all of the money. And Willie is also a slang term for penis. In other words, he's a real you-know-what with Walter for stealing the money. So again, all of these names are very significant. And might I suggest, as we're talking about the characters, the plant itself is a character as much as any of the human beings. It's incredibly important and it needs to be cast correctly. It's got to be a sad looking plant that's on its last legs to represent the family, which is also on its last legs. It's kept alive mostly because of Mama's love, much like the family is kept alive by Mama's love. And as Mama says, the plant isn't getting enough sun and it doesn't have enough space to grow. Just like the family isn't getting enough sun and doesn't have enough space to grow. So this plant represents the family. Notice that the family needs a place to put down its roots, just like the plant needs a place to put down its roots. This plant has outgrown its pot. This family has outgrown its home. They were supposed to stay in that apartment for just a small amount of time, and instead they've been there for decades. If we think about the title, raisin, a raisin is a dried fruit. And it's a grape that basically has lost most of its moisture. It can be tasty and it can be nutritious. But if you were to put a raisin in the sun, it would become inedible because it would lose all of its moisture and life force. That's exactly what's happening to this family. They are like a raisin that happens to be in the sun where they are losing their life force. If you think about color imagery, raisins are dark. And so is this family as well as African American and their skin color. And if we wanted to contrast that with sun, which oftentimes is seen as light, and the sun can be a positive thing because it can help you grow, but it can also lead to drought and it can kill. So I think we've got all of those plays on words as well as some of the slang. Raising could be slang or could be said in slang terms as raisin if you drop your G's. And this entire play is about raising. And this is about raising a family, raising oneself above one's condition, and particularly raising sons, not S-U-N-S, but S-O-N-S, as Mama is still raising her son Walter, and Walter is trying to raise his son Travis. So you can see all the multiple meanings in this particular title. And that said, the Hughes poem about what happens to a dream deferred is going to be particularly relevant because ultimately that's going to be the question for us as we continue on with our next class is what did you think about this particular poem in reference to dreams. But for today's attendance question, I just thought what I would do is I would ask you what you thought about A Raisin in the Sun. Now that I've had a little bit of time to talk about it, did you like or dislike this play and why? Now that we've talked a little bit about Mama and the money. And next class, we can talk a little bit more about what happens to a dream deferred, put some closure onto Raisin in the Sun, and finally move forward to our last unit, poetry. And we can also talk a little bit more about upcoming writing assignments, because eventually you will have a journal, as I had indicated. Ideally, you would get that in on the 24th, which is Tuesday by midnight, right before the Thanksgiving break. But again, if you need an extension, just let me know. And the paper, ideally, you'd get that in on the 10th of December, which would be close to the very ending of the semester. But we've got still a little bit of wiggle room. And next class, we can talk a little bit more about paper topics as well. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and I'll be curious to know if you enjoyed Raisin in the Sun or not and why. Take care. Bye bye.